Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com. Today I'll be showing you how to make a post-it note holder featuring some Lawn Fawn stamps for the latest lawnscaping challenge, which is a color challenge. We're going to start with some watercolor paper to make the ocean background. I use the Canson 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I've started by cutting the watercolor paper into 3x3 squares. A post-it note is 3x3, so I know that with the finished product that 3x3 would be about a good size for the panel, and I'll have enough room to mat it several times and bring in some of the other colors. I will be using two colors of distress ink, the tumbled glass and the peacock feathers, as well as a mini mister. So I'm going to spread some of the ink out. I'm going to start with the lighter color, because if you add too much of the dark color it will overwhelm things and you won't be able to see the variation. So I'm just going to add like little bits of the darker color in for the first time. And after I spread the ink over my Ranger Craft sheet, which resists the ink so it bubbles up and can go onto the paper, I'm going to spray it with the mister. I'm going to get it good and wet, and then I'm going to dip the 3x3 piece of watercolor paper into it, squish it around, move it so that it's completely covered. If you have sections that have a lot of ink, you can kind of tap them off onto a napkin. You're going to be dipping it in the ink several times and in fact layering it on top. So this first time you're looking to just get a nice coverage of the whole piece. And you see I'm dipping a second piece into it just so that I can use up all the ink that's on my table rather than just wiping it up and essentially wasting it. I'm going to make several panels, and then that way I can use these other panels to make several post-it note holders, or I can just use them for a different project in the future. But rather than waste ink, I'm just trying to use it up a little bit. And when I finish using up all this ink, I'm going to wipe up any excess that is left, and then I'll be moving on to adding the darker colors. You can see when I compare the piece that I have now to a finished piece, there's a lot more of the peacock feathers in it, and there's also those kind of bubble looking pieces or splotches. So this time I've just tapped on a bunch of the peacock feathers, sprayed it with water, and rather than pressing it in and squishing it, I'm just going to tap it onto the ink, trying to get streaks and bubbles and just a lot more variation in the image. Tapping it on the napkin also adds some texture because the napkin itself has texture. So I'm just going to continue to dip my piece in the splotchy ink, and after a while the paper is getting really saturated and it's not picking up ink in an interesting way. So I'm going to dry it with my heat gun for a little bit so that way it will pick up ink differently. So if you're ever feeling like it's not coming out the way you want, you can stop, dry it, and then continue to apply ink. Normally I would probably bring the piece over to the side to apply the heat so that I wasn't drying all of my ink underneath, but it doesn't dry too fast, so you don't have to worry about it if you want to dry it directly over it. So now you see as I dip it in, the splotches and the bubbles are coming out better. And so I'm going to stop again and heat it up. And you can just continue to do this process. You can also add more ink to your craft sheet until it's the way that you like it. So here I'm going to show it to you up close. I like that it has splotchy areas, darker and lighter areas. I think that really gives it the effect of being an ocean. So I'm happy with this piece and ready to move on. So I'm just wiping off the surface here. So now we're going to move on to the stamping. I want to add some sandhills to the bottom of the ocean. You can kind of see me trying it out there with the stamp set. That stamp set is Life is Good from Lawn Fawn, and I'm going to be stamping on sandpaper. That way I don't have to color or anything, it just gives a really great sand texture very easily. The only thing is, because sandpaper is a non-porous surface, you're going to have to use StazOn Jet Black ink. Most inks will smear on a non-porous surface, but StazOn will make a great impression and not smear at all. The only issue is it does stain your stamps, and I know that some people don't like that. But I don't have a problem with it because it doesn't affect the way that the stamp stamps in the future. It's not like the ink spreads to the next time. So now I'm going to cut out the sandhills along the black stamped line, and I'm going to use my Tim Holtz Tonic scissors because they're meant for cutting heavy duty things. a lot of scissors might dull when you cut sandpaper, because that's the whole point of sandpaper, is to kind of smooth things out, but that can be bad for your scissors. So I would just suggest using a scissor that you're not too worried about. So after cutting on the black line, I'm going to cut from one bottom of the hill to the next bottom of the hill so that the hill lies flat. I'm cutting out 3 hills because the sand hill doesn't entirely cover the bottom of the paper, and so I'm going to need 2 extra hills on the side to make sure the whole bottom is covered. In order to attach the sand hills to the paper, I'm going to use some Tombow Mono Multi-Glue. And you'll see in a minute that while the Tombow does great for sticking the sandpaper to the watercolor paper, unfortunately the Tombow Mono Multi doesn't do a good job of sticking the sandpaper to the sandpaper. So when I glue on that last piece in the middle, it doesn't stick very well. And so then you'll see that I move on and I try again to glue it down with some glossy accents, which does a much better job. So if you're gluing any of your elements onto sandpaper, I would suggest, instead of using the Tombow Mono Multi, to use glossy accents or Ranger matte medium, something that is a little bit stronger of a hold. And so you see that I'm overlapping the sand hills so they cover the entire bottom here on the ocean paper. And after I go back and fix the middle sand hill with some glossy accents and it's good and well and stuck, I'm going to simply trim off the 2 edges of the sand hills so that the whole bottom is covered evenly. So now it's time to add some cute critters to our card. This time I'm using the Lawn Fawn set Critters in the Sea, and I'm going to be using the dolphin, but I'm also thinking about some other stamps that I'll want to use, but I just know the dolphin's going to be my main piece. I'm going to use Memento Tuxedo Black ink because I know that I'll be coloring my elements with Copic markers and it doesn't smear with Copic markers. So I'm going to stamp the dolphin a couple times. As you remember, I was able to make a couple of the water panels at the beginning because I was using up all the ink, so I just want to have some extras on hand so that I can make more than one if I have time. I know the dolphin's going to be a gray color, which isn't really tying in all of the colors from the Lawnscaping Challenge, so I've decided to add in some other smaller elements. I'm thinking about the seashell, there's some small fish, and I know they would look great orange, and also there's a seahorse, and seahorses are often portrayed in many different colors, so I'm thinking I could pull in some of the yellow with the seahorse, and the orange with the seashell, and the little goldfish. So next I'm going to show you how I color in the dolphin with Copic markers. I'm going to be using the W1 and W3 markers to color him. Because I'm going to fussy cut him, which means I'm going to cut right to the black edge, I'm not worried about going outside of the lines at all. So on my first coverage with the W1 marker, I'm just scribbling it right across the paper, intentionally going out of the lines. Then I'm going to go in and add some shadows with the W3. I know that the light source is going to be from the top of the dolphin because the dolphin is under the water and the sunlight would be from the top of the water. So I know the shadows need to be along his belly, and also of course there should be a shadow right under there where his fin is because his body would be casting a shadow onto his fin. So after I lay down the W3 for the shadows, I'm going to come back with the W1 and blend it out, coming from the bottom pushing towards the top so that the W3 is blended into the W1 area. And then here you can see what he looks like when he was blended out. I know that it was a little unfocused when I was doing the coloring. So now I'm going to show you the quick coloring of these other little elements. You'll see that one way to do it is to just cover the element with the lighter color, in this case YR65, and then again the light source is coming from the top, so I'll put the darker on the bottom, and so after I put on the darker color I can blend it out. The other way to do it, which you saw me do on the shell, was where you first apply the darker color and then you move on to the lighter color. So for the orange elements I used YR65 and YR68, and for the yellow seahorse I used Y06 and Y08, putting again the darker color on the bottom. So now you see all my elements are colored and cut out. I added a little bit more fish because I think it's always good to make sure that the space will be full without being crowded, and also that you have an odd number of elements because that always tends to look better. I know that I want to make sure that all of the orange elements aren't right next to each other and that the yellow seahorse breaks up the orange shell from the group of orange fish. So I'm adding the seahorse there on the far right and then the fish on the far left. And I'm just kind of playing with them around so I see how I like them arranged. I also know that I want to add in a sentiment. I'm thinking the Life is Good sentiment from the Life is Good stamp set would go nicely. It fits the space. I don't want to use a traditional card sentiment because it's not actually a card. It's something that's going to stay out on their desk. So to stamp the sentiment, I'm going to use the Archival Jet Black ink. It gives a really good, strong impression. And I'm going to first stamp the sentiment before I glue down any of the little pieces, so that way I make sure that I leave room for the sentiment. So next you'll see that I have the panel all completed. I've glued down all the little critters, and now I want to matte the panel so that I can bring in the yellow color a little bit more. I'm using a 3 1/4 by 3 1/4 yellow matte because the element is 3 by 3, so it'll just give it a nice thin border all around. Next we're going to move on to actually making the post-it note holder element. And I'm showing you the measurements here so that if you want to pause the video and write them down, but I will repeat them as I go through these steps. So here you can see what it looks like when it's finished. It's a piece of cardstock wrapped around the post-it note and then attached with some Velcro so that it can be pulled up and down. And so I'm going to start by cutting the cardstock to 9 inches by 3.5 inches. You're going to need a scoreboard for this, although actually you could just fold the elements when you measure with a ruler, but the scoreboard does make it easier if you have one on hand. I use a small Martha Stewart scoring board. And so I'm laying it longwise so that the 9 inches are across the scoring board, and I'm scoring at first 3.5 and then I'll score at 4. Now you'll notice that my paper is quite a bit longer than my scoreboard itself, so I'm going to need to actually move the paper down so that I can finish the scoring. So I'm moving that last score line to the 0, and I'm scoring at 3.5 and 4 again. If you had a longer scoreboard, you could simply score at 7.5 and 8 and it would go a little bit faster for you. Once you have all your score marks in, it's time to fold up the different elements of the box. So I'm just folding on each score line so that it comes together. And then you'll see that there's a little flap and you have to add some adhesive to that. I'm using the Tombow hook and loop tab, so that way it's basically like a piece of Velcro and can come in and off easily. So you're just going to stick one side down to the tab and then peel off the backing and push the other side down. And so then it creates that pull apart Velcro tab piece there. Next I want to add the panel to the front, so I'm going to make sure that I'm thinking about the way that the post-it note will be inside of it, so that way when they open it up, their post-it notes will be sticky at the top. So you saw that I just checked to make sure that everything was laying properly. Then you're going to have to glue in the sticky notes themselves and make sure you use a lot of adhesive so it doesn't come apart on your recipient. So here you can see some pictures of the finished product to help you understand what it will all look like in the end. If you have any other questions about how I created this project, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you like this video, please make sure you give it a thumbs up, and you can also subscribe to my channel or visit my blog at blog.jesscrafts.com. Thank you for watching today. I'm going to list the products in the video description below, and I hope to see you again.